Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm Jelaine Schmidt. I'm the director of the UVA Karsh Institute of Democracy's Memory Project. The Memory Project sponsors public events and initiatives that promote democratic, inclusive narratives about our collective past and present. Today, the Memory Project is pleased to host Sebastiaan Faber, who is the professor of Hispanic Studies at Oberlin College. He is born and raised in the Netherlands and has taught at Oberlin College since 1999, which is where I came to know him as my then colleague. Dr. Faber's areas of expertise are related to the history of the 1936 to 1939 Spanish Civil War. This pivotal, but often overlooked so-called interwar war against fascism has been largely forgotten by the general public and many historians alike. Faber researches the history and legacies of the international brigades, which fought alongside Spanish leftists in the ultimately failed attempt to repel the fascist military uprising, which was supported by Hitler and Mussolini. And aside for the audience today, for 4 decades after Spain's Civil War, the victorious fascists named streets and erected monuments in honor of anti-democratic figures. And so this is a sort of propagandistic authoritarian infrastructure that we confront today in the US South, of course. Professor Faber examines the ongoing effects of the 36-year Franco dictatorship for contemporary memory politics and debates about democracy in Spain. For a number of years, Dr. Faber has served as the chair and board of the Board of Governors of ALBA, which is the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives. ALBA promotes the study of the 2,900 Americans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade who ventured to 1930 Spain as allies with the democratically elected government's fight against a fascist military uprising. Professor Faber co-edits The Volunteer, which is ALBA's quarterly magazine, and he regularly contributes to Spanish and US media, including The Nation, Foreign Affairs, Jacobin, and Democracy Now! Dr. Faber is the author of numerous books about the Spanish Civil War, of which I will highlight just 2 recent titles that are most relevant to today's talk. Memory Battles of the Spanish Civil War, History, Fiction, and Photography, examines the varied treatment of the Spanish Civil War in Spanish historiography, literature, and visual culture. His 2021 book, Exhuming Franco, Spain's Second Transition, presents the voices of contemporary Spanish activists and journalists as they respond to the literally groundbreaking 2019 exhumation and reburial of the dictator's remains. In today's talk, Memories of Anti-Fascism, What the US Can Learn from Spain, Dr. Faber will speak to us about Spanish activists' recent demands for government accountability and their efforts to reclaim public spaces as sites of democratic values. Let's welcome Dr. Faber.
Thank you, Jelaine, and thanks, Claire Payton, too, for the lovely attentions and making me feel so welcome. It's great to be back at the University of Virginia, which I think changed its name to UV. Is that right? As Jelaine said, I've been at Oberlin for 20-some years, and I've been involved with ALBA for 20-some years as well. And we were just talking earlier today how strange it is to be an academic in the times that we're living, and how the times that we're living makes one question the usefulness always of the type of work that we as academics are supposed to be doing, which doesn't tend to reach many wide audiences or many readers. I think personally, my work with ALBA has helped make me feel better about my work as an academic, because we work with a community of memory in the United States. We work with Spain. And in a way, journalism for me has also been an interesting kind of route to basically apply the same kind of skills and do the same kind of work, but just in a different venue for normal people, as I would like to say, who can just like read a piece. And it's been challenging, though. It's hard as an academic to do that work, because it makes you doubt yourself a lot, because we're not trained as journalists or trained to do rigorous research. So it's an interesting kind of proposition, but I think it's the only, for myself, it's the only way to deal with what's going on and to at least feel like I'm contributing to something. All right, let's get started. My first chapter is called Transition Envy. When the Netflix feature Argentina 1985 premiered at the San Sebastian Film Festival last fall in September, it was received with praise and with jealousy. The film, directed by Santiago Mitre and featuring Ricardo Darín as the prosecutor Julio César Stracera, recounts the first trial of the military dictatorship held only 2 years after democracy returned to Argentina. In Spain, viewers couldn't help comparing the Argentine situation to their own. 48 years after the death of Francisco Franco, not a single representative of his regime, which controlled the country for close to 40 years, has been held judicially accountable. In February, Mitre's film won a Goya, the Spanish Oscar, for the best Latin American production. During the live broadcast of the award ceremony on Spanish public television, the commentator, the anchor, shared a spontaneous thought that immediately went viral in Spain.
1985, qué envidia se siente al ver esta película, al ver al dictador juzgado y condenado, y no muriendo en una cama. Era la gran favorita, es candidata al Oscar, y en ella, en la película Santiago Mitre, a un Ricardo Darín estelar.
Qué envidia se siente al ver esta película, al ver al dictador juzgado y condenado, y no muriendo en una cama. Watching this film, one feels such envy, seeing the dictator tried and sentenced instead of dying in a bed. And one of the things I'd like you to take away from this talk is that this comment on Spanish public television is testament to the success of Spain's grassroots memory movement and its 2 decades worth of work. But since not everybody here, I think, is fully familiar with the Spanish context, I'll do some quick history first. Well, Franco installed himself as a right-wing military dictator in 1939, 3 years after helping organize a military coup meant to overthrow the democratically elected progressive government of Spain's Second Republic. The coup failed, provoking a 3-year civil war in which Franco's side was assisted heavily, as Delane said, by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, while the government was abandoned by the democratic powers of the West, the US, France, Great Britain. It was supported, though, by Mexico, the Soviet Union, and by tens of thousands of anti-fascist volunteers from around the world who joined the international brigades of the Republican People's Army, responding to a call from the Comintern, the Communist International, to volunteer for this fight. They included close to 3,000 Americans who became known, as Delane said, as the Lincoln Brigade, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. 3 years of fighting and 500,000 dead later, Franco declared victory in April of 1939, exactly 5 months before Hitler invaded Poland. By then, 500,000 Spaniards had fled, while Franco systematically undid all the progressive reforms of the 1930s, from women's and labor rights to separation of church and state to regional autonomy, and ruthlessly persecuted the opposition. Hundreds of thousands were imprisoned in jails and camps or exiled, while tens of thousands were executed. Although Spain was officially neutral in World War II, its relations with the Axis were more than friendly, at least up until the Battle of Stalingrad, when Franco smartly pivoted from an openly pro-fascist to an anti-communist profile. This paid off in 1945, because although Germany, Italy, and Japan were defeated, the Allies made no attempt to oust the fascist regime in Spain. And soon enough, a Cold War pact with the United States further solidified Franco, who ruled till his death at age 82. It was November 1975, and Saturday Night Live had just started its very first season on NBC. If you're curious, this is how Chevy Chase informed viewers on the weekend news update.
Well, after a long illness, General Alessio Francisco Franco died Wednesday. Reactions from world leaders were varied. Held in contempt as the last of the fascist dictators in the West by some, he was also eulogized by others, among them Richard Nixon, who said, quote, General Franco was a loyal friend and ally of the United States. He earned worldwide respect for Spain through firmness and fairness. Despite Franco's death and an expected burial tomorrow, doctors say the dictator's health has taken a turn for the worse.
As decreed in Franco's testament, his passing prompted the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, as opposed to a return to the republic he had overthrown. And the young King Juan Carlos I helped broker a democratic transition based on a negotiated agreement between the regime and the opposition. The transition centrally included a blanket amnesty for all politically motivated crimes, which was demanded by the opposition, and helped liberate the many political prisoners of the regime. But it also covered representatives of the regime. And in the 46 years since, the amnesty legislation has in practice served as a full stop law, preventing the victims of the dictatorship from finding any redress in the Spanish court system. The Spanish transition, which was relatively peaceful, was long seen as exemplary. But since the turn of the millennium, grassroots civil society groups have denounced its lack of attention to matters of justice and memory. Their insistent pressure resulted in two memory laws, adopted in 2007 and 2022, both passed with a left-wing parliamentary majority, but rejected by the right, which claims, and still claims, that the transition had achieved reconciliation between two sides that both committed atrocities and both carried part of the blame for the war. Among other things, these two laws regulate state support for family members seeking to exhume the mass graves with thousands of victims of right-wing violence that are still spread across the country. And the laws call for the removal of remnants of the dictatorship in public spaces, as Jelaine mentioned, including monuments and street names. But both laws do not touch the amnesty law, make no mention of perpetrators, and are stingy and cagey about the topic of financial reparations for victims of the regime. Who dares to compare? Argentina in 1985 wasn't the first time that the Spanish debate about the past referenced the Southern Cone. In fact, together with Germany, Chile and Argentina are probably the most frequently mentioned counterexamples to Spain's quote-unquote pact of silence. In the early 2000s, when the first teams of volunteers began exhuming these mass graves, those who were indignant at Spain's lack of transitional justice regularly invoked other countries. I'm going to show you two clips from a 2003 documentary produced by Montserrat Mengo and Ricard Vélez for Catalan Public Television about one of those early exhumations. There are going to be two clips. First, you see an interview with a woman who explains what happened in the region of León. And then we see a pretty impactful scene of, it's an emotional scene where the first remains of some people's family members appear as they're digging. So it's a cool content one. This is, it's called La Fosa del Silencio, La Fosa del Silencio. They chose as the Spanish translation, as the English translation for their film, The Spanish Holocaust.
Toda esta zona de la provincia de León, que se sepa así un poco más o menos, pasa de los 12.000. Así en estas condiciones, de cogerlos y sacarlos de noche y desaparición completa sin saber por qué ni por qué no. Y lo peor es eso, que yo, fíjate los años que hace, que fue en el año 37, y era imposible ni de mencionarlo siquiera.
They were buried in a mass grave without a plaque or an inscription, not even a death certificate. Franco's regime hid all traces of its crimes. It wiped out all memory of the victims. It didn't even set apart an area where they could be remembered. Today is a moment many families have been waiting for.
Ni olvido, ni perdono, ni perdonaré. Ni perdonaré, ni perdonaré. Un juicio legal, el que la hizo, el que la paga.
¿Quién era quien más la hacía?
Y las envidias y los
No sign of the 37 bodies thought to be in the mass grave was found on the first day of digging.
Y tengo 4 tíos, 2 hermanos de mi madre, un hermano de mi padre y el marido de una hermana de mi madre. Mi madre, toda la vida pensando en este sitio. Sí, lo que pasa es que yo no puedo decir que se olviden del holocausto, que se olviden de la política de Auschwitz, que se olviden de los que Pinochet de una manera u otra no. Sin embargo, en España hubo que correr un filomeno, olvidar a todos nuestros familiares, olvidar las penas, las angustias y todo lo demás. Aquí no sé por qué hay que olvidarlo todo. Y no ni cuenta nueva. Aquí no se puede buscar responsable. Sí, de algunos hasta les parece mal esto.
What's interesting to me is that already in 2003, there's a sense of like other countries are doing something different. Why can't we do that here? So that's what I mean by the power of comparison. The year before, the same production team that made this film had shot in Spain with a documentary that revealed that the Franco regime had systematically separated children from their imprisoned mothers to raise them in orphanages or illegally give them up for adoption to regime-friendly families. And that, of course, too, immediately triggered the comparison with Argentina, which in the La Historia Oficial already in the mid-80s had sort of like brought that whole story out. Perhaps the most significant connection with the Southern Cone, though, was terminological. In the early 2000s, the memory movement started referring to the victims of right-wing violence in Spain as desaparecidos, disappeared, where before they'd been referred to as represaliados, fusilados, or simply víctimas. In 2008, when the first attempt was made to judicially investigate Francoist crimes, Baltasar Garzón, the investigative judge who had become world famous in '98 when he indicted Pinochet, who was then visiting London, Garzón argued that many victims had in fact been forcibly disappeared, and because disappearance is a crime against humanity by international law, he argued the amnesty law was not applicable. His attempt was sabotaged by the Supreme Court eventually, but he did help push the narrative, shift the narrative further. Now, were the Spanish victims really like the Latin American desaparecidos? The social anthropologist Francisco Ferrandis, who has studied exhumations from the beginning, at first balked at the idea. When Garzón spoke of 114,266 Spanish disappeared, I thought he was insane. He told me in an interview some years ago. But as time went on, Paco Ferrandis changed his mind. I've concluded that it does make sense to think of the Spanish victims as disappeared, although they're a different kind of disappeared than those of Chile and Argentina, he told me. The term doesn't just turn up in the Spanish context through a simple act of copying. Its root is more complicated. It starts in Chile and Argentina, yes, but then the term is taken up by the Inter-American Court, which establishes a convention in '94 that labels forced disappearance as a crime against humanity. Later, the UN's General Assembly approved the International Convention for the Protection of All People from Forced Disappearances in New York in 2006. That convention has been ratified by a large number of countries, and from that point on, any country in the world can anchor its historical experience in that universal concept. Now, this narrative shift to desaparecidos, sparked by this apparently minor change, he told me was hard to overestimate. Think about it, he said. When we first laid eyes on the first mass graves, what we saw were victims of executions. When we look at a grave now, we see victims of forced disappearance. In legal anthropology, we talk about the social lives of rights, the way a right enters the public's imagination or social space, independent of its judicial routes. In that sense, in Spain, the notion of forced disappearance has really struck a chord. It's a crime against humanity that has no statute of limitations and continues to be committed every day until the disappeared person is found. Now, are the Spanish victims really desaparecidos in this sense? At first, I wasn't so sure, but I've changed my mind. The truth is that many Spanish families don't know or only vaguely know what happened to their loved ones and where they might be buried. We don't know the identity of many of the exhumed corpses. Isn't that a pattern of forced disappearance too? Of course it is. Now, at the time, these comparisons sparked indignant reactions from among the defenders of the Spanish transition. The prominent historian Santos Curia, for example, warned in the early 2000s against what he called the Argentinization of Spain's debate about its past. Now, to be sure, comparisons and analogies across time or space are always tricky, right? Tolstoy famously said, all happy families are alike, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And the same might be said of societies that try to deal with legacies of state violence, historical memory, and justice. Local and national contexts are extremely important and always different. Still, though, comparisons can be legitimate and politically productive because there is a universal dimension to these experiences and conflicts. When you think about it, the defining feature of the development of transitional justice in the past couple of decades, both as a practice and in international law, has precisely been the notion that it is possible and indeed desirable to establish guidelines that transcend national and local contexts. If human rights are universal, then ways to come to terms with the legacies of state violence should also be universal to some extent. Memory movements in Spain and elsewhere have certainly been appealing to these universal norms and the institutions that embody them, including the United Nations, often with success. They also often have used comparisons to great rhetorical and political effect. In Spain, as we saw, the Southern Cone and Germany have loomed large as counterexamples. And of course, in the US, Germany has recently been brought up too, with increasing frequency, to point out the need for changes in the way this country remembers and teaches its own histories of slavery, racial terror, and violence, especially in the South. Brian Stevenson, who was just here, I heard, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, began referring to Germany's approach to its memory question many, many years ago, including it as a standard talking point in his many, many speeches and interviews. I'm going to show you a little bit on later, a more recent interview, but he's been saying these things for many years. This is an interview with CNN in 2019.
With the Holocaust, you see the symbols of the stones everywhere that mark the places where Jewish families were abducted. The Germans want you to go to the Holocaust Memorial. There are no Adolf Hitler statues in Germany. They don't want to be thought of as Nazis and fascists. In this country, we haven't talked about slavery. We haven't marked the places where lynchings took place. We haven't talked about this legacy, and I think that has to change.
So this, the phrase, in Germany, you don't see statues to Hitler, is exactly the phrase that the Spanish memory movement has been using since the late 90s to argue against for the removal of statues of Franco and his generals. Elsewhere, Stevenson has pointed out how strange it would be if Germany still had the death penalty and if a disproportionate number of the people convicted to death would be Jews, right? And that's, he says, that's exactly what's analogously happening in the US. 2 years ago, the philosopher Susan Neiman spoke right here on Zoom in similar terms as part of the Memory Project in conversation with Ghislaine and with Michelle Norris. And while acknowledging that all histories are different, she also argued that US has things to learn from Germany, which she said is actually has been much further along in this difficult process of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, right? The working off of the past. But she also added, as a nice point, that the US itself is on its way and kind of ahead in a way in comparison to, say, Great Britain or my own country, Holland, right, which we still have a long way to go before we have come to terms with our share in the slave trade, or for that matter, the post-colonial repression in Indonesia after World War II. Still, everywhere, these kinds of comparisons are quick to spark resistance, as Neiman has also pointed out. In both the US and in Spain, this resistance to comparisons as a way to call out Spain, like, look, other countries are doing this, why aren't we doing that? This resistance has come largely from conservative sectors. As we know, the idea that US citizens may be subject to international law has also been long anathema to the judicial rights. And legal scholars like Eric Posner have been arguing for years against universal jurisdiction or the International Criminal Court. And the whole idea that the US might have something to learn from other countries undermines America's superiority complex and the idea of US exceptionalism. And in Spain, too, the idea that the country may have something to learn from its former Latin American colonies is offensive to many Spanish nationalists. 2 decades of grassroots struggle. That this exceptionalist line of thought has not prevailed, however, in Spain, at least for now, is clear from the preamble to the new memory law, the law of democratic memory that was adopted in October last year. While the preamble of the 2007 law still celebrated the, quote, spirit of the transition, framing the country's democratization as a process peculiar to Spain, the new text squarely places Spaniards' ethical obligations toward the past in an international framework. Since the end of the civil wars and global conflicts that raised Europe in the 20th century, and especially since the Holocaust, the opening paragraph reads, the push for policies of democratic memory has become a moral duty, a duty that needs to be strengthened in order to neutralize forgetting and to avoid repeating the most tragic episodes in history. The solid commitment to the pedagogy of never again has become a fundamental ethical imperative for democratic societies around the world. So you see that there's a real gesture toward we are part of an international moral community, and it's our duty, therefore, to come to terms with the violence of the past. One thing that has certainly not changed in that decade and a half since the first memory law was approved is the attitude of the Spanish right. The deputies and senators of the largest conservative party, the Partido Popular, PP, voted against both laws, claiming in both cases that the legislation needlessly stirred up past conflicts. Just now, in October 22, they were joined in their no vote by the deputies of the far-right party Vox, VOX, which did not exist yet in 2007. A radical spin-off of the PP, I mean, its founders were members of the PP that founded their own farther-right party. Vox combines a homegrown Spanish conservatism, centralist, deeply Catholic, genealogically linked to the Franco regime, with Trumpist tactics, claiming the banner of free speech against what they call the dictatorship of political correctness. Its leaders defend the right to Francoist nostalgia and the right to be proud of the country's imperial and evangelizing past. Only that kind of patriotic pride, they claim, will make Spain great again. The right's stubborn resistance to the memory laws, if anything, there's been retrenchment, shows that in Spain, the efforts to work off the past are far from complete. There isn't even consensus between left and right on the need to work off any past. Still, it's undeniable that the memory movement has achieved major successes in the past 20 years. And the reception of the Argentine movie that I showed at the beginning is sort of common sense. Man, those Argentines are lucky. They got to convict a dictator and we didn't. That is, to me, proof of the success of shifting public opinion. Progress, I would say, has actually been palpable. Some years ago, I spoke about this with one of the founders of the memory movement, Emilio Silva, a journalist from León. And when we talked, he told me this: the cork that prevented us from talking about Franco has popped. We can finally discuss what needs to be discussed. You see the same thing happening around the exhumations. We notice it in the towns. There's been a learning process. When we started, every exhumation would generate tremendous tensions. Those are gone now. Many people today know that the Franco regime committed crimes. I always say that what we do is really very simple. We just want the families to be able to rebury their loved ones. We don't want to impose any specific memory on anyone. Some children of the exhumed support the conservative Partido Popular, for example. Some are embarrassed to admit it, but others couldn't care less. Those are things we have to let happen. Key in this learning process have been the sheer images of the graves, the bones being exposed, the skull with the bullet hole. In a way, these mass graves are a Spanish mirror that we have been avoiding for 40 years. Now we are telling the country, don't look away, turn your head and face that mirror. That there is you. That we have stopped avoiding the mirror is a conquest. The graves constitute the knowledge that helps fight that version of Spanish history that says Franco wasn't so bad. Exhuming the mass graves has helped create a context that has allowed us to tell a much more powerful story about Francoism. After you've seen the bodies, the image of the grave, you can talk about the harshness of the dictatorship without seeming Manichaean. Before, when the repression was much more hidden, it seemed that when people talked about the repression, they were making things up. Now, the struggle to redefine the narrative has not been easy. The battlefronts have been many. Textbooks, monuments, street names, statues, graves, reparations, the parliament, the courts, national and international, by the way. There's still a case going on in Argentina of Spanish victims trying to, under universal jurisdiction, find justice for their suffering in Argentine court. When one of the remaining equestrian statues of Franco was removed from a prominent spot in Madrid in 2005, it had to be done in the middle of the night to avoid a scandal. And you've seen this rhyming, right? Like, so here, this is maybe the universal aspect of it, is how do you lift a equestrian statue from its block. But so in 2005, it had to be done in the middle of the night to avoid a scandal. But by 2019, when Franco's remains were exhumed from the massive monument in which they were buried, the event was streamed live on television. In the meantime, the Spanish right, inspired by Trump's success in the US, has tried to turn the memory battles into a culture war, accusing the left of imposing an ideologically skewed version of the past that demonizes healthy patriotism the same way that feminism demonizes healthy masculinity. More insidiously, the two parties on the right, the PP and Vox, have also tried to associate anti-fascism, present and past, with terrorism, a move that's easier to pull off in Spain than in other countries like France or my own country, Holland, which founded their post-war national identities on anti-fascism as a moral touchstone. It's not the case in Spain. In Spain, it's easier to brand an anti-Franco fighter during the dictatorship as a terrorist. In this framework, democracy somehow becomes the golden mean between the extremes, both equally rejectable, of fascism and anti-fascism. It's a weird kind of redefining of morality, political morality. With the fascists in that framework actually beating the left on respectability. So anti-fascist and the fascists are both too extreme, but the fascists, they at least are decent people. Right? That's the sort of the frame of this kind of frame. Susan Neiman has shown convincingly that the United States can learn from the Germans, as her book says. I'd like to argue along similar lines that the Spanish case may contain some useful lessons as well. And I need to add that what I've seen of the memory project here is putting many of those lessons into practice, but they're definitely expandable to the rest of the United States. And since I like round numbers, I thought I'd try to come up with 10 lessons. A little exaggerated, but hey, 10 is it's a decalogue. So first, acknowledge the effective dimension of the battle over history. People often have deep emotional investments in particular narratives about the past that are tied up with their values and with their identities, especially if they grew up with them. Telling them that those narratives are false or immoral is not always helpful. When I was talking about this not so long ago with the historian Matilde Eroa, she said, for many, it's hard to hear someone tell them, look, what you thought you knew about our history is wrong. Our research shows things happen differently. People naturally reject that. So it's important to acknowledge, I think, this emotional difficulty. And similarly, it's also important to help people distinguish, as you explained in the documentary too, that it's something, it's one thing to love your family. If only you're going to love your family and your ancestors. It's another thing to have the opportunity to acknowledge historical injustices. Those don't have to, it's not either or. Similarly, it's important to help people distinguish, as Neiman also says, between history and public memory, right? Removing a monument is not the same as erasing history. It has nothing to do with it. As Neiman says, monuments are not about history. Monuments are about values. Changing textbooks, on the other hand, as we see happening in Florida, that is erasing history. Right? This brings us to education. It is an important central battlefront in all this. And that, of course, goes beyond the 5 to 22-year-old bracket of people in schools. The right has actually known this for a long time. So much so that they're way ahead of us. The return to patriotic history, the Trump Historical Commission, the book banning, and the threats to academic freedom that we're seeing now are only the most recent chapter. As my colleague Renee Romano at Oberlin, who has extensively studied racial reckoning in the South, told me in an interview last year, the right is way ahead of us. Rush Limbaugh, for example, not only included a whole lot of history in his radio shows over the past 30 years, but he and his wife wrote a series of children's books on early American history that have been bestsellers. The right in this country has used its own media channels to gather an enormous amount of influence over the narrative of the national past. When it comes to education, the Spanish case shows us that we should never underestimate the power of popular culture. Movies, novels, fiction really does shape people's way, especially if it's well researched. And a lot of the opinion shift in Spain can be attributed to TV series, movies, and popular best-selling novels, like Almudena Grandes, for example, recently died. Lesson 5 is community organizing is key. Like we saw in Spain, the grassroots memory is really grassroots. It's local people, local communities, of volunteers doing work and keeping up the pressure on the political establishment. So these memory loss would have happened without this grassroots organization. And currently still, it's Emilio Silva and company who keep the pressure on the politicians to fulfill their promises and to keep adding more and better laws. Comparisons are useful, but they're also risky. This is an argument I try to make in Exhuming Franco, the book that Jelaine mentioned. As we've seen, comparisons between countries and the positive examples of other countries can serve to shame, in a good way, our own communities into action, into change. But if the counterexamples are presented in too positive a light, too idealizing a light, without including their own nuances and challenges, comparisons can also backfire into fatalism, which is another form of exceptionalism when you think about it. So in Spain, for example, a particular version of how the Germans have done it becomes often an excuse for Spanish to say, see, we are just a lost cause. We will never be able to do what the Germans did. Whereas if you tell the German story more complicatedly, how long it took them, as Susan Lehman says, right? And the reparations, the corporate reparations, like the BMW paying back people, it's 2000, that's the 21st century, right? So you have to, comparisons are good, but it's good to include the gray in those comparisons, right? To also to not make people feel so bad. And the same goes for analogies with the past. We should always resist the temptation to simplify the past, but we should also resist the temptation to depoliticize the past, right? And I think it's really important to always connect past struggles to present struggles. In Spain, you can see that with the debate about republicanism or municipalism, right? And so it's important to keep the past alive in that way politically. And for that same reason, it's important to not shy away from what Jelaine calls the F word, right? Fascism, anti-fascism. It's important to continue identifying explicitly democracy with anti-fascism as a moral touchstone in the past and in the present. This has been a challenge in Spain, as I explained, because Spain did not, and Spanish democracy did not define itself as anti-fascist after Franco died. And I think in the US, it's a challenge too, right? Because for some reason, fascism is not associated often with the US's own history of racial injustice. And it has to do also with the minimalization of the influence of radicals in the civil rights movement, for example, that we see happening in textbooks now all the time. Interestingly, the Spanish Civil War provides a nice narrative wedge to pry apart this US reluctance to talk about fascism and anti-fascism. In the educational work that we do with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archives, we feature African-American volunteers who in their international brigades, who explicitly state that they went to Spain to fight Jim Crow, gun in hand, right? That connection was made by those Black Americans who fought and often died in Spain. Lesson 9, it's just very hard, but we should resist being pulled into culture wars. Culture wars is where the right wins the battle. I would say it's important to not get ourselves pulled into that. For my 10th lessons, I want to close with a reflection on the role of academics and historians in particular in these current times. Now we've seen all over the world that the right has rediscovered patriotic history. The invocation of a heroic past has been key in far-right populist discourse around the world. Rejecting self-critical readings of national history, allegedly imposed by progressive, anti-patriotic, and self-serving elites, populist parties claim the people's right to the patriotic pride necessary for national vigor, while rejecting shame and other unhealthy or uncomfortable politically correct sentiments. We've seen it in France, we've seen it in Britain, we've seen it in Holland, we've seen it in the US, and even in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, the far-right party, has claimed the right to be proud of the German army in World War II, for example. These revisionist trends explicitly impugn, especially question, the two principal institutional sources of the official narrative about the past, the state and the university, but particularly historians. Now, in many countries, the left has also been questioning official narratives. The revisionism has also come from the left. This is certainly the case for Spain's memory movement, who often pitted itself against established historians to question their narrative of the way Spanish democracy came to be. Some historians in Spain and elsewhere have dismissed these challenges from the left and the right as equally populist and equally dangerous, equally threatening to the rigor of the historical practice. And I think that's a mistake. It's true that both the left and the right engage in what Ifat Goodman and Jenny Wüstenberg call memory activism. It's also true that they share other features. Both the left and the right turn the narrative of the national past into a political battlefield. Both invoke a notion of the people in order to question the authority of the state and the academy as sources of that narrative. Both underscore the value of a shared past, not just in political, but in affective and emotional terms. The past is important insofar as it's able to inspire pride, shame, love, hate, solidarity, or identification among present generations. And both have often been dismissed by the academy or by the state. But they're not two sides of the same coin. The memory activism on the right tends to be driven by nostalgia. Nostalgia less for the past as such than for past narratives of the past, the way we learned it in school in the 1950s, let's say. The history it promotes is remarkably traditional. It consists of stories of patriotic pride, national grandeur, filled with national feats, and with heroes, and without any of the ethical or epistemological complications of modern historiography. The memory activism on the left, by contrast, is driven by a desire to complicate hegemonic narratives, even further by giving voice to subaltern groups. It also seeks to empower today's citizens in their role as memory activists, as happening here in the Memory Project, as critical participants in the construction of the past, generally with clear political implications for the present. So this is exactly what's happening here, right, in Charlottesville. All right, I'm going to just close with a brief epilogue, which I thought would be fitting. A mini contribution to the Memory Project by going back to the work we do with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archives. As I said, close to 3,000 volunteers from the United States joined the international brigades to fight fascism in the Spanish Civil War. And several had ties to Virginia. So I thought it'd be fitting to close with a short tribute to 5 of them. It's very brief. This is our website in case you're interested. Edward Johnson, born in Lynchburg, VA, was one of the oldest American volunteers in Spain His parents had been enslaved. He'd served in the US Army during World War I. He joined the CPUSA, the Communist Party, in 1932 after participating in the National Hunger March. In Spain, he was captured and he spent a year in a POW camp. He was in the same camp with Claude Pringle, born in Holston, Virginia, but raised in West Virginia. Also fought in World War I and worked as a coal miner afterward. Oscar Hunter, who lost his mother while he was young, was radicalized during his 5 years at the Hampton Institute in Hampton, Virginia. He joined the party in 1932 and became an organizer in New York and Chicago, where he studied journalism at Northwestern, ran a bookstore on the campus of the University of Chicago, and joined the local John Reed Club, where he met Richard Wright. In Spain, he served with the Tom Mooney Machine Gun Company and he was wounded in action. And although he'd left the party by the early 50s, he and his family were heavily harassed by the FBI. During the 60s, he was an active anti-Vietnam protester. And later he became one of the founders in the 70s of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives. Bunny Rucker was born in Roanoke, Virginia, but his family moved to Columbus when he was a kid to escape the racial violence of the South. In the 30s, he joined the Communist Party. In Spain, he served as a driver and became friends with Langston Hughes, who was in Spain as a journalist. Back in Columbus, he co-founded the Vanguard League, which sought to integrate movie theaters, community swimming pools, and other public spaces. He went back to serve in the US Army this time during World War II and was wounded in action in Italy. And back in the US, in New York, he worked as an organizer on the Henry Wallace campaign, presidential campaign. He ran for city council, and he ended up getting his BA in library science. And he served out his working life for 20 years as the chief librarian of New Jersey's East Orange Public Library. Finally, Crawford Morgan from North Carolina moved to Norfolk, Virginia when he was a kid and grew up there. In 1932, he joined the YCL, the Young Communist League. He was wounded in Spain, served in the US Army also during World War II, and then worked as a truck driver and printer. In 1954, he was called as a defense witness in a hearing of what was called the Subversive Activities Control Board, which was a US government agency that was about to declare the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which was an organization, as a subversive organization as defined by the Attorney General. And the defense counsel called Crawford Morgan up as a defense witness. In his testimony, he said that, quote, "I had a pretty good idea of what fascism was. I got a chance, as a Black man in the US, he said, I have a pretty good idea of what fascism was. In Spain, I got a chance to fight it with bullets. And I went there and fought it with bullets. If I get a chance to fight it with bullets again, I will fight it with bullets again." And this is a very interesting testimony that we use in the workshops we do with high school teachers as a primary source material to share with high school students. This is mid-1950s testimony of a Black veteran of the Spanish Civil War and how he frames his anti-fascist commitment purely and only through his experience in the United States. I'm going to close with a plug. We're offering a 5-week workshop for high school teachers starting in 2 weeks. The registration deadline is the day after tomorrow. It's $50 for 5 weeks worth. You meet an hour 15 every week, and there's homework in between. You get 22.5 professional development points for it in the Massachusetts system, and you can get graduate credit optionally as well. So if you know high school teachers or college teachers for that matter, want to work with primary sources related to the experience of the anti-fascists in Spain, let me know. I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We want to open it up to attendees for questions, discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's very, very interesting. We can hear me discussing for many, many hours. I grew up in Spain. I went to the university with Franco. I went to high school with Franco. My father was a Falangista. My mother was a socialist. They were dead in both sides. So the case of Spain is not simple at all. There was a Spanish Civil War. 40 years of dictatorship. And as an historian that I am, I think the history of Spain was a real disaster. There are no years in the history of Spain that we can say and say, oh, they were good years. The only good years in the history of Spain, at least as a protagonist, as an historian I am, they were the transition. The years from 1975 to 2002, when the Aznar government decided to join the United States in the war in Iraq. That was the end of transition. I totally agree with you in terms of memoria histórica, but we have to see the times. My memory as a young person coming to freedom in 1975 is the task in front of Spain. They were so big.
Yeah.
And the most important one was to be European, to be considered into the Europe, to join freedom, to exercise freedom. It came La Movida, it came all these movements.
Sure.
And it took Spain many years to think about that they were all these desaparecidos.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And so what I mean is, it's not, I don't want to blame this generation of not tackling this problem, because the problems in front of the Spanish society were huge.
Yeah.
There was no constitutions. We didn't know how to exercise freedom and so on and so forth. It doesn't mean I disagree with you. I agree with you, but you say at one point in your talk, we cannot use other examples. So last night I was watching the movie 1985. I was in Buenos Aires when these things were happening in 1985. So there is no comparison at all, Argentina and Spain during the Dirty War and the Spanish Civil War. So what I'm trying to say is I thank you for the talk, but all these topics have to be taken one by one. We cannot do this kind of memory and let's see how we tackle it, and Spain didn't do their job. I'm not sure about that, but and today is much more complicated than during the transition. But
Yeah, no, I completely see your point, and thank you so much for your contribution. Of course, you can. I mean, it's no use to look back and say people should have done that differently. Like that's not useful at all. It's better to look at it and see, understand what happened. So the transition happened the way it happened. You said because people wanted to move forward, because the regime was still quite powerful, because the army was right there, right? There's all kinds of circumstances that occurred. But that doesn't mean, I would say two things. One, it doesn't mean that Spain today can collectively decide to tell its national story national narrative differently.
yeah,
In schools, in monuments, in museums, right, whatever. And it can decide that it feels it can no longer afford morally to ignore the rights of the victims, right? So that people can bury their loved ones, right? And how you build that consensus is a really complicated question. I completely agree with you. Yeah, because as everywhere else, polarization in Spain is it keeps increasing. Every time you think like it can get worse, and it still gets worse. Like the same here between left and the right. So in a polarized landscape, it's so easy to mobilize sentimental investments in past narratives about the past for political purposes, which both the left and the right have been doing. Right? But I think my main point is that despite that, progress has been made in Spain. It's really, I think, knowledge has increased and common sense about what happened has shifted, right? Like Emilio Silva says. That said, how to translate that into policies, right, is hugely complicated. And for exhuming Franco, the book, I spoke with 30 or so people, and I asked all of them, would it be possible to build a museum of the Spanish Civil War in Spain today? And all of them said, like, no way. Can you imagine? trying to, even if you get experts together to try to, I don't know, build a collection and come up with curatorially with a, what do you put in there? Like, it's really complicated, right? Because things are so divided. That said, though, I mean, currently in Spain, still in schools, the 20th century is brushed over, right? Like, you still talk to kids who are 16 or 18, and what they get is some dates and some figures, and that's pretty much it. There's very, very little engagement with that part of the past, and that is something that can certainly change. But I completely take your point that it's very complicated, and that's why I said local contexts are important.
Yeah.
But when it comes to ethical imperatives, comparisons can be useful.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, first of all, thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. I think you illuminate a lot of processes that are happening in most European countries, East and West. I have two questions that are sort of short but different. You mentioned during your presentation something along the lines of how memory battles should not become culture wars.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, how would you distinguish between the two? What's the relationship between them, or maybe there's no relationship at all?
Yeah, that's it.
Because for me, it seems like they're different sides of the same coin.
Mhm.
Then just very briefly, a second question: how does memory? How do memory movements operate in Portugal, which is perhaps the closer neighbor to Spain, and also came out of a dictatorship, right? More or less.
Yeah, so the case, I'll start with the second one and come back to the case. Portugal is very interesting because they did their transitions are different, right? There was judicial accountability for the regime. And in her book, The Justice Cascade, what's her name, the author of The Justice Cascade? I don't remember. Catherine Sickink puts that as a counterexample, right? So what I would say is that Portugal's different approach to the dictatorship ultimately resulted, with all kinds of caveats, in a healthier democracy in a way, right? In more higher level participation. And in Spain, among the things that the transition established was a pretty big gulf between the political establishment and the voters, right? And I think that in Portugal is less. How do you avoid the culture war? That's a really, really good question. I think that you can have memory battles at the level of community, at debates about monuments, but as soon as it becomes electorally used for electoral politics, then it becomes a culture war, I think. Culture wars, I think, have to do with, lead to extreme dismissal of the opponent, right? Because extreme polarization and what we see happening in Florida right now, for example, right? And I think the left can choose to participate in that, or you can try to tone it down. Yeah.
Could you repeat what you were saying about erasing history by removing statues you displaced?
Oh, yeah, that's Susan Neiman's argument. That so monuments do not represent history. Monuments represent those parts of history that we want to remember, admire. So that's just, monuments are about values, not about history. If you decide, if you have a plaque and you decide, or you have a statue and decide to remove it, the person represent does not disappear from the history books, right? Or from the textbooks or anything like that. It's just you decide who you want to honor. So it's in Spain, Ricard Viñas, a Catalan historian, has made this point very clearly in his own way. He says, look, as a democratic society, relating to, like, for example, the Spanish Civil War, right, or the Franco dictatorship, as a democratic society, it's our obligation to study the past and to research it. Citizens have the choice if they want to remember the past or not. It's a civil right to participate in the memory of a community, but it's not an obligation. But it makes sense that a democracy would want to, a democracy based on certain shared values would want to honor in its monuments or street names or whatever, those entities or people or concepts that align with those values. So it makes perfect sense that at a certain point, if a community decides that a slave owner no longer represents their values, that and there's a statue to the slave owner, they remove the statue and put a statue up of somebody else that does represent more of their values. So that's the idea. So the argument, like removing the monument erases history, is spurious. In part also because many monuments were not in fact put up when these people lived or did what they did, right? They're often products of very specific moments in history. Like a typical thing in Spain now is that they get really incensed when in the United States, statues of Columbus are removed. Spanish are like, no, what did Columbus ever do wrong? Right? These statues were put up by the Italian American community, but in the late 19th century, early 20th century. That's a very specific moment in history, and nothing to do with Spain whatsoever, right? But no, so that's a little bit same idea. Yeah.
Well, the Columbus example, the Columbus thing actually brings to mind another question about how we apply the lessons of some Spanish record with the dictatorship to this broader question of colonialism, because there's a sort of horrible intimacy that comes from confronting, the past that occurred. I mean, again, we've seen this here in Charlottesville many times over the years. The excavation of mass graves in Catalonia or in the Basque Country. But obviously, there's not just in these places where Franco personally was responsible for mass death and atrocities in Morocco during the War. And so, how did politics shift? The politics of memory broadly shift when we think about the colonial legacy as well. And Columbus living in Mars, at least in this country.
That's a super interesting question. So if you look at the tactics of the Spanish right, it shifted a while ago already from glorifying or excusing the Franco regime, which Vox still does, but really to sort of provoke the left. But the real tactic on the Spanish right has been to go way back and rewrite or reconfirm a triumphalist narrative of Spanish imperial enterprise, for example, right? So Maria Elvira Roca Varela is a best-selling quote-unquote historian. She's really a high school teacher who has become incredibly popular with the narrative of national pride, right? So all these, like the Brits and the Dutch and the Americans have tried to make us feel bad about our proud imperial history, colonial history in the Americas and in Africa. And but really, we were really trying to do the good thing, and we were a generous empire as opposed to the Brits, those Protestants. But this is literally. So I was telling over lunch late last year, I wrote a piece in a Spanish magazine about a documentary that was produced by this woman with a very prominent Spanish filmmaker that was broadcast on Spanish public television, and then was set to be touring the United States to show the Americans the true story of Spanish, as opposed to all the best that they learned about Spain in schools. And that was sponsored by the Instituto Cervantes, the official state cultural institute. And this movie is exactly, it's like the Calvinists burned many more people than the Catholics did. And the indigenous people in the United States were super happy with the Spaniards, and everybody got along so great. And thanks to that, they now have universities and roads and whatever. So in that sense, the folding into colonial history has worked really well for the right. And the left is behind on that, for sure. I mean, already during the times of the Republic, I've did some work on Spanish exiles in Mexico specifically. And to the Mexicans, the Spaniards came with such an assumed imperial outlook, even if when they were liberal Republicans, right? Because the complete lack of awareness of that. And I think in Spain today, there's just like in my own country, I mean, I don't want to point fingers to Spain. There's a complete lack of acknowledgement of what it has meant to be an imperial power. Yeah. So yeah. Go ahead.
I'm curious on the topic of monuments. Are there any conversations being had about, what takes its place, especially in areas that are, super public and
No, completely. No, that's a museological kind of argument, right? So a good example is the place where Franco was buried is the Valley of the Fallen, Valle de los Caídos, which is now called the Valle de Cuelgamuros. So this is a massive monument that he built, he had built over 20 years' time, partly with prison labor. That still stands as it was. It's crumbling a bit, but there's a massive cross, and this church, this basilica hewn into live rock. And now that he's been removed, his body's been removed from it, or he's buried when he died. The question is, what do we do with this? And that's exactly them. So do we destroy it? Do we let it crumble? It becomes a ruin of fascism. Do we fix it up and then make it an educational space? Those kinds of exactly the question. So there's kind of between letting it be because it's history, right? Reshaping it actively, like intervening and really making it different, like like cutting it apart and melting it into something else, right? Or leaving it be, but then frame it differently with a different plaque, with a different kind of curatorial thing. So that's definitely a debate. And Paco Ferrandis, the guy I quoted earlier, who is now serves in the Spanish government as part to do these kinds of things. He always says, like, the more creative, the better. We have to involve artists in all this. Like, we need artists, like your monument here, which is beautiful. It's the enslaved laborers, workers. But generally, polarization is such that those discussions never quite come off the ground. Those debates are not quite as productive as they could be. But there's definitely debate about that. Yeah. There's the Zaragoza in Aragon is trying to put up something of a Spanish War Museum in Teruel. Teruel was a major city of the battle between the Republicans and the Nationalists. And they got historians involved and they worked on it. Those historians were replaced because they weren't good or something like that. They were disappointed. The new historians came in, everything good. And then the city decided, and then in front, we're going to put a monument up to all the victims of the Spanish War, regardless of who they fought for. And then it's like, no, that's like going back to the Valle de los Caídos, where supposedly there's no, so it's very complicated. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm a little quick today. So I have two perhaps related questions. The first is, you can just speak sort of what's the debate around the word fascism in Spain, and where do people fall in terms of even being willing to call Franco a fascist? Because I think about in the context of the United States, right? So often discussions about fascism and fascism stop at the door of saying that's not what the United States is all about, right? The famous moment when I think David might can correct me, but when someone in '68 told George Wallace a fascist at a rally, and he said, "I thought he was a fascist. I couldn't ever be one," right? And that made me think of the one of your main points, which is right. The movements to associate democracy with anti-fascism.
Right.
It strikes me as so important that I read about Black anti-fascists in the United States. They were trying to associate democracy with fascism, right, and say it's not really a democracy at all. So that's the first question: is like, what is the political breakdown of who even uses that word?
Yeah.
I mean, the second one is, what is the impact? It's implicit in this topic. What's the impact of Cold War memory and current anti-communism? Like looking at these spaces, right?
Yeah.
How does that kind of lingering red scare shape these conversations?
Yeah, those are two really good questions. So I'll appeal to the Spaniards in the room to see if what I'm saying is right. In terms of the word fascist, I think it's used frequently and happily by the left. And at this point, it's owned proudly by the far right as a I forget what you call it in English, but when you take a bad name somebody calls you and turn it into a proud name, right? I forget. In Dutch we say "feuzenaar," but that's you know there. So un facha is anybody who's conservative in sort of like progressive circles, right? But in the electoral, the last couple of elections where Vox, the new party, Faber party, participated, the left definitely said, just like we see in France with the Assemblée Nationale, or we see in Holland with the Forum for Democracy, or we see in Germany. It's like, these are fascist parties. We have to stop these in their tracks. So in that sense, it's used a lot. Now, in terms of Cold War, the interesting thing in Spain is that because of Cold War, in my opinion, because of Cold War politics, a concerted effort was made by political scientists in the US to define the Franco regime as non-fascist, right, authoritarian. So Juan Lin's Spaniard at Yale famously sort of like theorized the Franco regime as an authoritarian regime, right? So it's within political science, whatever. But that jive very nicely with Franco's attempt, right, to disassociate himself from his Nazi and fascist origins and to become the sentinel of the West, right? The one and only who defeated the communism so far, right? In the Spanish Civil War. The witch hunts, the anti-communism in Spanish political discourse has come up recently, actually. So at first, during the transition, the legalization of the Communist Party, which occurred, was considered very dangerous and controversial, especially by the army, but it happened. And then, since then, communists have been as respectable as they have been elsewhere in Europe. Right? Parliamentary members, ministers of government, like in Italy or in France or in Holland or in Germany. But in the last 4 or 5 years, the Partido Popular has adopted a tactic not unlike Trumpism. It's a Trumpist tactic, which is to impugn the very legitimacy of the left to do anything, to even form a government. The left formed a government, parliamentary majority. That's how democracy works. But the right insists, no, these are communists and terrorists, and like so they undermine the very legitimacy of the democratic process, like Trump has done here, right? So and then it's the specter of communism is very easy to conjure up. So the Díaz Ayuso, the president of the Autonomous Community of Madrid, said 2 years ago in a run-up to elections, and now the left is going to win. I bet they're going to burn churches again. That we can like so straight back to 1936. Like this is the same left that was burning churches then. What they'll go for? What will they go for next? The Constitution, the flag, right? Like that kind of like idea, right? So, and in Spain, it's on the one hand, communism. Terrorism is another bugbear because the parliament, the members of parliament who represent pro-independence parties from the peripheral regions have ties like Sinn Féin has to the IRA. They have ties to like genealogical ties to militant or terrorist organizations. But then they become then delegitimized right away. So the current name for the current progressive coalition government in Spain by the right is considered a Frankenstein government because it's a coalition, right? And because it consists of Spain haters, communists, and terrorists.
Something toward this,
Yeah, sure.
Well, is the president of the government of Madrid? There's also the mayor of Madrid right now who currently said, "Seremos fascistas, pero sabemos gobernar." We might be fascist, but we know how to do.
Yeah, it's a little bit the idea of like fascism and anti-fascism both are bad, but at least the fascists are good at governing. Kind of, right?
They keep holding it more with some support, which is worrying. But like to my question, really, it's something about like memory of anti-fascism and memory of Francoism and its aftermath as connected to anti-imperialism, specifically U.S. anti-imperialism against the United States. To the point of these president right now, they face consequences of coming back from Spain, like McCarthy, etc. At the same time that the United States was providing with aid to Franco under the Marshall Plans and similar initiatives. Also taking into account how France and the UK did nothing to prevent German and Italian help to Franco during the Civil War. So my question would be like, in your opinion, how much anti-capitalism should be included in these pedagogical memory initiatives? Given that it's so like it comes with it.
You're suddenly putting me in a position where I'm prescribing things that makes me feel uncomfortable. I think that it should have a 52.5% anti-capitalism. No, I don't. I mean, turn it around, like, how do you teach this stuff in a high school, right? That's a question. And that's a question that we go into its workshops that we do. How do you teach this stuff in the United States, where you presented a 16-year-old with like, these were communists who fought fascism, and the 16-year-old was like, what? I thought communism and fascism were the same thing. They were both bad. Right? It's complicated. So in the Spanish case, I think that this sort of disagreeing with what the Chief just said, that the history is a disaster, right? Just kind of like a sad way of looking at it. There's plenty of interesting things in Spanish history that will allow us to think critically about our own present and about our own future, right? So republicanism in Spain has a long tradition that sort of pops up now and again, but it's an undercurrent most of the time. Currently, the history of Spanish republicanism is not very explicitly taught, included in memorialization of any kind, right? But in reality, it's a super interesting way to think about how power is shared or how power is established, what political system works best for a country. And that then can lead you into a critical view on capitalism, for example, right? Or US imperialism, or the US role as a supporter of Francoism, or the passivity of the Western democracies when the war broke out. But it's important, I think, to not, maybe this goes back to a point I was making about US history. Like, it's important to not hide that these were anti-capitalist, they were communists, right? So if you say that Rosa Parks was a lady who just decided not to get up from her seat in the bus without giving any context about her political education and the community she was a part of and the ideas that moved that community, right? Then it becomes empty, right? And then a contemporary student can do nothing with that, right? Like, so in that sense, I would say tell the whole story, including the story of anti-clericalism and the complication of Stalinism and how difficult a time these guys had when they came back from Spain after having lost the war, right? They were members of the CP. And then in August, Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact. And then between August 39 and June of 41, they can sort of no longer be really anti-fascist because they have to say, well, the US and Nazi Germany are really the same thing. And only after Hitler invades the Soviet Union can they come back. Those things you have to tell as well. Those are really complicated stories. More questions? Are you guys ready for food?
I've got one question.
Oh.
Yes, yeah. You mentioned that those Spanish politicians, activists, and such who are pushing for these kind of more progressive initiatives, with memory politics, they're saying, one of the things that they're saying is that, hey, we're members of the international community. This is what we do now, and this sort of thing. And when the right pushes back against these memory politics initiatives, does that come with a kind of anti-EU, political leanings, or any kind of objection to kind of being a part of this?
That's a really good question, because as our colleague here just said, Spain wanted to become European, right? That's the entire goal of that's one of the main goals of the transition. And that's shared by the left and the right, right? It's a desire to be European. And if you would ask a right-wing member of Partido Popular if they believe the Holocaust should be remembered, they say, yes, of course, it's our moral duty to remember the victims of the Holocaust. And so in that sense, they want to participate as much as the other guy in the European ethical consensus when it comes to the past. But somehow they bracket Spanish, but Franco wasn't like that, right? So in terms of popular culture, it's an interesting topic. If you look at movies from the past 30 years in Spain that include both Spanish fascists and German fascists, or novels for that matter. The German fascists are the bad guys, as they are in any movie. But the Spanish fascists are kind of like, they're still Spaniards. They're kind of clumsy fascists, or kind of too nice to be fascists. They like sex too much to be a good fascist, or something like that. There's always something, right, that sort of makes them more recognizable. mean, to me, there's a best-selling novel that helped set off this whole debate, Soldiers of Salamis by Farkas, which came out in 2000. And it's a fascinating story, really well written, problematic in different ways, but the main sort of conceit of the story is that an author in the present tries to find this one Republican soldier who, when he had the chance to shoot and kill one of the leaders of the fascist party, decided not to and spare his life. Right? And that becomes, for the author, the narrator of the story, the key to reconciliation, the key to living together again as Spaniards, because he decided not to kill the fascists, and he could have killed them, but we're Spaniards. But okay, this man, this Roman soldier, is a hero in this story because he spares the life. He's also a hero because after sparing the life of the Spanish fascist, he goes and joins the army of the Free French to beat the hell of the Nazis and kill many, many Nazis in Africa and in France. So he's the hero for sparing the life of the Spanish fascists and for killing lots of Nazis at the same time. And that is kind of the framework there. So it's a detachment, right? So as a result, one of the attempts, and successful, I would say, of the memory movement has been to reattach Franco to Germany and Italy, especially Germany, right? So, and there's so much documentary evidence of that. Like any like between 39 and 43, like any newspaper that came out of Spain would have like Hitler's birthday this, and the nice German girls sent us this, and we sent them that. Okay, there's lots of confirmation of that alliance. But that attachment, reattachment has to do with that. Other example?
Well, I think we're gonna put this all